All right. So what we have here, let me just pull it up here. This is my, actually, minimize that. That is the issue. So, all right, exploration of forms of mindfulness and inner development. In our contemporary world, we have access to vast amounts of knowledge and information made possible by advancements in science and technology. But there are certain important aspects of our lives for which our understanding lags behind. Our objective third-person understanding of the outer world has never been more clear and detailed. But if we want to improve the quality of our lives and social relations, then we need more development and understanding of the inner world, including first-person consciousness and second-person interrelating. While science and technology have given us great access to a wealth of information, one could make a strong argument that our quality of life and social relations are still not improving at the same rate as advances in these other areas. Our mainstream knowledge institutions and educational programs are often solely focused on understanding the outer world, and unfortunately, they rarely focus much time or attention to the inner world. It is undeniably important to understand mind-independent facts about phenomena such as laws of physics, the complex dynamics of biology, and the neurochemical processes that operate within our bodies and brains. This knowledge is all essential to our efforts at improving our lives, our biosphere, and our society, but this does not give the full picture because lived conscious experience needs to be foregrounded as well. The origin of our values and meaning in life comes from our inner experiences. So we need to develop a deeper understanding of this as well. If we focus our education and research only on things that are external to conscious experience and that we can clearly identify and objectively measure, then we are neglecting our inner world, both at the individual and collective levels. We need more inner development, and we need more reliable methods, processes, and paradigms for developing this knowledge and for fostering inner growth. Yeah, so you can still again, you can interject at any point if things are kind of unclear. So I'm going to continue here. Okay, so there has been some important work done in these areas in recent years. But we are still lacking the rigor that would provide more clarity and reliability to these endeavors, which is holding back mainstream acceptance. Several organizations, including academic institutions and think tanks, have made significant progress in giving us important insights into our inner world and the relation to the outer world. But their work has not yet been integrated into unifying frameworks that would help people make sense of all of it. It would be beneficial if these people and organizations had a shared language, a unified way of speaking about the inner world so that they can talk to each other better and cooperate and collaborate more efficiently. And this would provide the ability to have better research and education in these areas. It would also be beneficial if we had tables, diagrams, and maps to show how our most detailed psychological and cognitive science frameworks are correlated with brain processes and with different forms of our inner experiences. We need to know how certain patterns of our inner experiences relate to those experienced by others, and also we need to try to understand how social and cultural phenomena emerge out of the psychology of individuals and their interactions. Regarding this proposal, one might wonder what is new. What will be done here that hasn't already been done? Researchers, academics, philosophers, and thought leaders have made great gains in the area of inner development and awareness. This is not in dispute, yet the information that is not immediately accessible or usable by the mainstream of society, and we are far from mainstream acceptance of such principles or advances. Like spokes emanating from a hub, discoveries and the language and culture associated with such ideas take their own course. Arguably, the further we go in time, the less connected such work and ideas are to other points of view. In effect, when it comes to inner awareness and mindfulness, there is no hub, no unifying framework, no multidisciplinary effort. There is no unifying language or set of core principles that could potentially create a new discipline with a common language. The proposed synthesis and correlation. The accompanying table is an attempt at providing what is needed toward this end. It shows the correlations between several schools of thought and the works of many organizations within the broad realms of mindfulness, inner development, and metacognition. The table shows the interrelations between each of the following: Gregg Henriques' Unified Theory of Knowledge, UTOK, Ken Wilber's Integral Theory and AQAL model, 4 Cognitive Science of John Vervaeke, among others, the relevant branches of philosophy, including phenomenology, which is studying lived conscious experience, and hermeneutics, studying communication and interpretation, and their respective sub-branches. The Inner Development Goals, IDG Initiative, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which includes System 1 and System 2 thinking, the neural correlates and the biological basis for different forms of lived conscious experience, concepts such as mindfulness, shadow, conflict, maturation, and end goals, and different forms of psychotechnologies. Some of these items center around psychology, some cognitive science and development. Some, but not all, of these systems also get into the relation to neurology, biology, and sociocultural dynamics. All right, so I'm going to show a table in a moment. I'm going to go through the table. The rows in the table are intended to represent the smallest identifiable granularity of types of inner awareness and inner development practice, which can be seen to align with the left quadrants within integral theory, as given within several books by Ken Wilber. The left quadrants include the subjective, upper left, and intersubjective, lower left. This represents the primary division within the table. Both of these are further subdivided into 3 rows, which are based on John Vervaeke's 4 P's of knowing in a certain way that collapses these into 3. So 1 based is forms of practice that are based on participatory knowing and sometimes also developing into procedural knowing. The second type would be those primarily involving perspectival knowing. And the third would be involving propositional knowing that takes into account all other forms of embodied knowing. So for those of you who are familiar with the 4 P's of knowing, I have essentially, 3 categories here that are for the upper left, like subjective, and then 3 additional categories for the lower left, that's intersubjective. And the reason I don't have 4 is because it seems like it would be a little bit unnecessary to have a whole category just for procedural knowing. Essentially you have participatory knowing as the ground of being, as the ground of the agent arena relationship, and sometimes then you can develop muscle memory and have these procedures. You don't always have that, especially when you are, just in going about your life and your interactions. That is then the transjective interrelation, deep interrelation between you as the agent and the arena as everything else, So I'm saying that, I didn't really need to have a separate category for procedural knowing, because it's, even though that's definitely important, I kind of just wrapped it up into, participatory and procedural, that interconnection as one of the categories. And then perspectival knowing, that is what it is like to be or do something, that felt sense of thinking and feeling. And then propositional knowing, which is being able to say something out loud or say something to other people or in your own mind that is maybe true or false, you know, having that that ability to have the speak with language and symbols. So there are forms of embodied knowing that are more basic and fundamental than that. And I'm saying, okay, so with Vervaeke's system, there essentially are, you know, 3 forms of knowing that are a little more basic than that. But as far as this table goes, I'm really just kind of collapsing that into just a 2-level type of thing, just to make things a little bit simpler here. And this is also based on the tripartite model of mind. So how many of you guys are familiar with that? Okay, so and I'll get to that, you know, that there are different models of the mind that a lot of times it just really comes down to 3 things, you know, and it even goes back to Freud with this id, ego, and superego, which Gregg Henriques has a more updated version of that that's based on psychology and cognitive science. So I'm doing that, and I'm saying essentially these 3 aspects of, they can be seen as 3 forms of embodied experience at the subjective and the intersubjective level. So that's what, and those also have essentially correlates to the objectivity, but then to understand things from an embodied experience in their own right is important for each of those categories. Now there ends up being 6 of them, and they all have these correlations. So how many of you guys are familiar with 4E cognitive science? So this is John Vervaeke's work. Actually, he's not the one who came up with that originally, but it goes back, he's done a lot of work with this 4E cognitive science. It's where cognitive science isn't just computational, what's going on in the mind. It is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And there is definitely a connection here with this. I'm saying embodiment is essentially at the phenomenological level, the lived conscious experience that is more fundamental, and I can see embedded, enacted, and extended as forms of embodiment. And those actually end up aligning with 3 of the 6 rows in this table that I'm going to show. And then I ended up coming up with 3 more E's for the other 3, which are examined, expressed, and evolving. Taking some creative liberties with that. So also the connection to Gregg Henriques' unified theory of knowledge. It is based on this updated tripartite model with the map of mind. Mind 1 being, the way he defines it, there's an inside and an outside of mind 1. So the inside is neurocognition and the outside is overt behavior. And then mind 2 is the phenomenology, the lived conscious experience. In his original form, he doesn't have an A and a B to that, but he's admitting that there could be, like there's my lived conscious experience, and then there's lived conscious experience of this deep interaction. And then he has mind 3 as justification systems. And this is the mode of cognition that differentiates humanity from the rest of the animal kingdom, because we can say things and we can communicate with each other in symbolic language. And we are essentially justifying, we are offering justifications for just about everything we do in life when we communicate. And we have a way of communicating internally to ourselves, which he calls mind 3A, and then mind 3B is our public justification. So these rows in the table essentially kind of align with that, except insofar as to say that his way he defines mind 1A and 1B, those seem to be in the realm of objectivity, you know, like, okay, I'm doing brain scans and understanding the neurology, or I'm measuring your movements. So that's essentially mind one, as he says. But if we look at the bridge between the neurology, neurocognition, and lived experience, and there is that participatory knowing, and there's also the muscle memory of the procedural knowing. So that's what I'm saying, is that there is that bridge in between mind one and mind two, serving as that procedural participatory knowing. And I have that for both for your internal, going about your life, not really a social context, but the things that you need to do in that agent arena relationship. And then there's the direct participatory social relating with other conscious beings. And that, so those are two things that both represent practices or granularities of practice that show up in this table. And then there's the core of the mind two for both of those, that lived experience. And then there's the mind three, which is actually, in this case, I'm saying, not just as we oftentimes kind of disembody and get really abstract with our logical thinking, but what's relevant to this is how we can bring forward everything that's at the deeper levels of embodiment into our propositional knowing, and that what we can call embodied wisdom. And then there's an embodied wisdom both within your own cognition and also within the social sphere. So those show up as rows in this table as well. So that's kind of an introduction to what I'm about to show you. I'm not sure if that introduction is making sense. I suppose maybe I can just show you the table. I can field questions before I even show you the table, just as a, if you have questions about this framing of the problem space and what I'm offering as kind of an introduction to the solution space. You can tell me if you have any questions. So I'll go ahead and I'll show you this just a moment. All right, so this is the table. You guys can see this? So as I was saying, we have 6 rows in this table, and 3 are for the upper left, subjective. 3 are for the lower left, intersubjective. And there's multiple correlations going on here for each of these. And as I was saying, we can think of, at least from the lived conscious experience goes, you can think of the forms of knowing as one way to really clearly define what those are. So one of them is based on participatory and sometimes developing into procedural knowing. We can see that I have that for this row here and also for this row. So we have that here in both places. And we also have primarily based on perspectival knowing at the subjective, and also down here at the intersubjective. And we also have involves propositional and taking into account all other forms of embodied knowing at the subjective level, and also down here at the intersubjective. So that's the basic structure of what I'm doing here. And if we look at that, we can see a lot of correlations for each of these 6. For example, there's a branch of philosophy. The branches of philosophy that are subjective are phenomenology. There's different sub branches of phenomenology. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with phenomenology, or maybe the work of Heidegger or Husserl. So as it happens, this row here is based on Heidegger, and also more recently Merleau-Ponty, and a lot of John Vervaeke's work is in this area here. This down here is this row is Okay, so that's existential. That's existential phenomenology. Is like, what is the core of your existence, the ground of being? This here is transcendental phenomenology. That is the understanding your lived experience. I'm sorry, understanding your lived experience, your consciousness from a perspectival point of view. And you can. This is more introspective. This is more meditative. It is called transcendental because in order to do this well accurately, you need to kind of transcend your natural state of mind and try to clarify your mental cognition and what could be called the reduction, or it's also called epique. The existential phenomenology is different because you're not really doing that through introspection. You're doing it through circumspection, which is a form of reflection that happens in the context. So, there are these examples of, rather than constantly reflecting on everything that you're doing in your life, you just do it. And then it's only a little bit after the fact, only when things are kind of not working, that you need to reflect on it. So this gets into quite a bit of the core of Heidegger's work, but it's a little hard to explain right now. I just wanted to throw that out as, there's quite a bit of Husserlian terminology that allows this to make more sense of what this distinction is and how I'm aligning one of them with more participatory knowing, the other with more perspectival knowing. So both of these end up getting wrapped up when you're bringing forth both of these forms of embodied knowing into a something that you can explain and understand at a linguistic level, then we can call that vision logic. We can say that's a certain kind of meta rationality, or at least this is my proposal. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. I'm trying to do a grand synthesis here. So if we go down to this lower left, the intersubjective, we can see a parallel here as well, because there is a distinction between having this at the participatory level, the empathetic hermeneutics, that's where we are directly participating in communication that is pre-linguistic. And these are practices. There are practices that do this. I don't know if you guys have heard of circling or other kinds of authentic relating practices. And there are ways. So you essentially participate in this we space. So it has this similarity to existential phenomenology, which is primarily when Heidegger was describing it, he's talking about what it's like to be at work, and doing mundane tasks, and working in situational awareness, in context. So there is no script for that. And it's also not something that you're just meditating over while you're doing it. So that's why it's participatory. But if you take that into a social context, in a more authentic social context, then you get this as well. This is why I'm identifying it as something distinct. We are in a social context. We are participating in understanding each other's empathy. So I'm saying that that's also distinct from having a meditative perspectival knowing into the we space. So each of these are important in their own right. They are different classes of psychotechnologies that can be, and capacities and lines of development that can be honed independently of each other. And they all ultimately they play into having this embodied wisdom. So that's why I'm identifying it separately. So there's a cultural hermeneutics. And this is a class of of understanding. This is the perspectival we space, where you need to do this in order to be able to understand people who come from different backgrounds in life. But rather than to just jump right into, talking to them in a way that it would be difficult to understand, you need to try to imagine, embody what their experiences are in a way that is pre-linguistic. Imagine what, and try to put yourself in their shoes of what experiences, thoughts, and feelings, and struggles, and other, other concerns and issues in their life. And so I'm not quite sure if this distinction is making sense. So one of the two, you are participating directly with in communication with people, but where the empathy isn't dependent so much on the words that are used. It's based on being there in the moment and having this situational connection. The other is also not really based so much on on the words that are used, but being able to have this imagination of somebody else's experience in life, which you can do because you have meditated on your own experiences in life. So these are parallel. This row is parallel to this row, and this row here is parallel to this row. And it all ultimately builds up into this having the propositional understanding into the we space, which is how we build social institutions, how we make our sociocultural, economic, and political systems work better, because we build up into that. We don't just disembody it or make some sort of abstractions, or wouldn't the world be better if we did this, without recognizing people's experiences at the ground level, not just your own, but others, and trying to build up in a deeper wisdom from that. So that's the reason that I'm doing this. I'm not quite sure if the pattern is really connecting with you guys, but that's the point of all of this. That's why there's essentially 6 rows. The tripartite model of mind definitely plays into this. And I have those actually further over in the rows here. So there's a lot in this table, but further over, if I can scroll over to that, we can see that there is the UTOK mind plane correlates. So that's the unified theory of knowledge of Gregg Henriques, and how he, as I was mentioning in the opening introduction, how he has the model of mind 1, 2, and 3. So approximately speaking, we can say that that aligns here with these 3, and also down here with these 3 in the more social context. So being both subjective and intersubjective. Although what he's actually talking about more than anything is what is actually happening psychologically. So there are ways of studying it objectively. There are ways of measuring that. And especially with this row here, where I have the neural correlates and biological basis, that gets into even more deep into the objectivity side of things. Now, admittedly, I don't have much of that yet, because that's not exactly my forte, but I mean to work with people to develop that. Excuse me. Let me see if I can get into a little more detail. So I've covered some of these. I think I've covered some of that. So the inner development dimensions. So each of these represents a certain class of psychotechnologies that can be developed. You can practice these psychotechnologies that are somewhat independent of other psychotechnologies that provide you that a certain form of inner development. In this case, there is the notion of inner existential depth. This first row here, the one that aligns with the subjective participatory. So some of these are based on the Listening Society book. How many of you guys have read the Listening Society by Hansi Freinacht? So Hansi Freinacht identifies some some interdevelopmental dimensions, and existential depth happens to be one of them. So I actually took some creative liberties a little bit. Not all of these are in the Hansi Freinacht books. Cultural code is one, and existential depth, and so is complexity. Aside from that, I looked at other taxonomies of inner development, and I was trying to bring in some more of these categories to augment and fill out the rest of this. Whereas Hansi wanted to reduce it to just four dimensions actually, and one of the dimensions happens to be state, so it's not really an inner development dimension. It's just like, how do you feel at any given moment? So the other three are more developmental dimensions, and that you can develop that way, and that, you know, tomorrow you still are developed in that way because of something that you did yesterday, you know. This is another correlation that I have here. This is the inner development goals. So how many of you guys are familiar with that? The inner development goals, which is meant to accompany the UN, the United Nations came up with this Sustainable Development Goals initiative. And there's a number of these, such as, you know, clean drinking water, and sanitation and education, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of these. And then there were some people who said, okay, so it's going to be difficult for us to do any of that unless we have a certain inner development so that we can recognize a deeper context, and we can coordinate better, and we can get along with each other better to work toward shared goals. So they put together some of these, and I actually, when I make this more public, there's links here you see on the definitions tab, and innerdevelopmentgoals.org is where you find out about that. There was a little bit of a connection that I saw between the inner development goals and this system. Now, admittedly, their system is they have 5 categories and 17 total goals. So that didn't really align with my 6 rows here, but I tried to fit it as good as I could. I did actually notice that there were a couple of them in particular that really did seem to connect pretty closely with the distinction I'm trying to make. And one of them is their distinction between relating, caring for others and the world, versus collaborating, social skills. So you can see that's these 2 rows right here. That seems to work pretty well. I also have this distinction, you know, between these first 2 rows, and I ended up seeing that these are both related to what they call being, relationship to self, and within that category they have 5 specific goals that I kind of split across these 2. So there you go. And so for each of these, I have a description of what mindfulness means and what authenticity means. And for those who are fans of John Vervaeke, I have a different understanding of what relevance realization means for that classification of practice, you know. And also this, as I was saying in the introduction, I was explaining, you know, this connection to embodiment, which is the 4E cognitive science that John Vervaeke has. So you have this first one here. Let me just read it out. These are all forms of embodiment. Is that this first one, this subjective, participatory, circumspective types of practices are enacted within the agent arena relationship. And the more perspectival, meditative, subjective and introspective experience in ecologies of practice, this is the presence felt through meditative awareness. This can be done through a body scan, and this is examined embodiment. So if we bring those together, we can say this is embodied wisdom that can be described and expressed and language, diagrams, and maps. So going then into the intersubjective, we have three that are parallel to that. So the participatory intersubjective, the empathic practices are interactive within the we space in which one is embedded. Like you're embedded in this conversation right now. And the perspectival intersubjective is extended into an intersexual and cross-cultural lens, because I don't really know what any of you guys came from. You know, there's a certain understanding that we have right now when we're participating in a conversation, but I would have to actually have a more meditative intersubjective context in order to try to understand where you're coming from and what your inner experience is. That's the reason that we have this distinction. And then if we bring these together into something that can make social change, this is embodied wisdom that is evolving through the development of mutual understanding and positive change. So that's why we have these 6 forms of embodiment that all they kind of seem to build towards something, you know. This is a row here that it has a connection. This system and type of thinking has a connection to Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with that. Like that's where thinking fast is automatic. You know, it's where it's something you don't really reflect on or think about very much. It just comes to you. And then there's that. And then thinking slow is more deliberate, more careful. I should say that in the current version of this, I'm going a little bit more with the more complicated reimagining of that John Vervaeke and Gregg Henriques came up with, where they wanted to change it into there's a system 1 and a system 2 and also a type 1 and a type 2. So there is quite a bit to that, but what they're basically saying with this is that they only consider system 2 to be propositional knowing, whether it's automatic, where you're given a problem that can be, you can explain it, you can give an answer in your intuition, in language. So that's like they're calling that system 2 because it's language oriented. It's a justification system. But it's type 1 because you came up with that answer through intuition. But then if you deliberate over it, it's type 2. Whereas if it's not really propositional, if it's below that in your cognitive stack, then that's system 1, as they say. There's a lot of embodied understanding that is really just before language comes into the picture in terms of your cognition. And then that we can say that one of the two is the participatory is more type 1, and then the more the perspectival, deliberate forms of understanding and really reflecting on your embodied experience, that is type 2. So did already cover some of that. Now I actually also have correlations to conflict, to shadow. That's a Jungian concept of shadow, that are things that you want to push aside rather than confront directly. It's uncomfortable for you to think of, so you kind of pretend like it's not there. And this applies to not only things inside of you, but also within your social relations. So there's implications for shadow for all of this. That's why I have some sort of an answer for each of them. For each of these also, I have just in general, what is the subject matter? What is like kind of a meta methodology for how to do these kinds of practices? I have end goals of what we're trying to aim for. So the end goals include, the flow state or the optimal grip or coping. That's for the subjective participatory. Some of you guys are familiar with the flow state or the optimal grip. So Vervaeke talks about that. And at this level for subjective perspectival, it's enlightenment, contentment. And for the subjective propositional, it's sovereignty and emotional self-regulation. So down here in the participatory intersubjective, we can say that that's tranquility in relationships, more in a more vibrant we space. And the intersubjective perspectival is social harmony and peaceful coexistence. Finally, the propositional intersubjective is essentially political and economic order and general well-being. So there might be some similarity in these concepts, but I'm attempting to define them narrowly enough so that we can say, okay, these are practices that we need to more narrowly focus on in our inner development processes, both individually and as groups, so that we can then build toward kind of a bigger picture. Because we're not going to just change our political economic systems without having these more grounded developmental processes that contribute to that. How many of you guys are familiar with the grow up, clean up, wake up system of? Yeah, so the way that Wilber and others were defining these, it seemed to align with what I'm doing here, sort of. Maybe, I don't know. I took a stab at aligning that because, okay, so we have clean up. In fact, I can go over here to the definitions. Clean up is associated mostly with intrapersonal shadow work and the processes of integrating it and becoming internally tranquil and harmonious. Okay, so there's a distinction then within Wilber's system between that and waking up, to awaken to higher spiritual states, which can lead to a profound sense of connection with nature and can develop one's will to transcendence. So that is one way in which these two can make more sense as how they're differentiated. This one here, this participatory subjective is cleanup, and the perspectival subjective is wake up. And some of you guys are familiar with grow up. Well, that's as he's defining, essentially grow up to higher levels of consciousness, especially emotional consciousness, and that is intended as the grow up is essentially intended to kind of wrap these wake up and clean up together and be something that can then be expressed. So further down here, Wilber actually has a system, in more recent years where he came up with 5 of these. He even has open up and show up. I added one more for build up because I needed 6. But we can go here and go back to the definitions. Show up is to identify one's unique gifts, to fulfill one's unique obligation, and to serve humanity in the world. And open up is to embody the fullness of presence in one's unashamed and committed context to love and sensuality and the full range of emotions to express itself. So I'm essentially saying that opening up is participatory within the we space, and showing up is perspectival within the we space. And then I had to come up with a new one here to round out the 6, and that's build up, is to build, develop, and evolve sociocultural, economic, and political institutions, and to drive positive change through embodied wisdom. For this column here, I have psychotechnologies. I attempted to come up with some sort of a list of psychotechnologies for each of these. There's a distinction between movement yoga and still yoga. And down here in this 3rd row, I have essentially Zen, because that seems to be in this category. Down here, I have circling and collective presencing as opposed to cultural historiography, cultural semantics, and transcultural dialogue. And I don't yet have anything for this one because I added it more recently. I had to just have some blanks there. And I attempted to put in some organizations that specialize in these different kinds of practices, and also influential thinkers for each of them. And it is still a work in progress. I'm not sure, if now that you've seen some of the content that I put into the table and where I'm putting these different concepts and how they correlate, if it's kind of clear how these each of these are intended to really be things that we can focus on. We can try to hone that capacity. And some of these more advanced psychotechnologies actually take into account more than one of these rows together, but then just to not lose sight of certain things that are foundational to our inner development is the reason why this table exists as distinct as we're having these 6 forms here, especially the ones that are more foundational, which is the participatory and perspectival, both at the subjective and at the intersubjective level. So we need to focus on those primarily, and then the embodied wisdom of the propositional can actually come a little later once we've actually been able to do that. So wanted to do this to see that we're covering our bases, so that we are having a diversity of practices. We are developing our lines, our inner capacities in a way that is well-rounded. And also where this plays in is that within, like if we were to have community development practices, this is one thing that I'm really trying to work on, is if we can have practices at the community level where there are leaders, people who are trained as leaders to help the community with these inner development practices, that they would be able to have some sort of a manual to help them do that, to figure out how to help their community members develop in different ways. So I thank you guys for listening to my spiel here. I probably threw quite a bit at you. Hopefully I didn't blow your mind too much. But I'm definitely, if you have any questions, comments, anything of the sort, now would be the time.
Thank you for that, Brandon. That was really fun. Obviously, there's a lot there, but the patterns are very clear and coherent. I've got a number of questions, but I'll just sort of start somewhere and then we can see where the conversation takes us. Something that I think is quite a similar predisposition between John, Gregg, and Ken is a sort of preference towards the maybe propositional and participatory, and acknowledging the perspectival, but not really committing to it, because that's sort of the layer where you drop into identity. And it's very hard to sort of maintain that meta sensibility whilst also like living through a culture. And so I'm wondering for you, do you have, and it's kind of a personal question, but do you have a particular like instantiation of the perspectival that your heart feels drawn towards? Like if you were going to take this map and try to like drop it down into a mythology and a sort of more of a narrative, where would you go with that personally? Because I know it is like a personal question.
That's a good question, and that is an excellent question, because that is the connection that people have to the perspectival knowing, are these shared myths or the narratives. That is the glue that connects your experiences from moment to moment, and what connects people to each other. Now it's difficult for me because I have been thinking about this, where I wanted to get away from the narratives from my traditional upbringing, which is from the Catholic Church. And I've been trying to understand, like, okay, so looking at the way you have people like Brendan Graham Dempsey and John Vervaeke and others coming up with these new myths and narratives, it's difficult for these to land with me because they seem a little bit artificial. The the narratives that land the best for me are the ones that actually have a big history model that you can situate your own experience within a developmental process of history, and also the development of the psychology and the modes of being and experiencing and knowing and thinking and feeling that developed through anthropology. So that's quite a bit to take in. But I think also when you do this, you can actually see a greater developmental trajectory that we're on. That's what for me connects to spirituality, and there are people who have written books about that in recent years. And here's where we've come from, and here's where we're going.
Just a little tack on, do you feel like there needs to be some sort of teleology for that to be compelling? And if so, do you personally feel like there is a telos?
I think so.
To this map?
I don't think that I really had teleology involved here. Well, maybe. Yeah, that's a good question, because that's one of the main things that Gregg is trying to do, where, with the advent of modern science, you have Galileo bracketing out the telos, and instead focusing on two of the four Aristotelian causes. That's the effective cause and the material cause. So the so-called final cause, or the formal cause, is actually something that's also been recognized even more so just in recent decades, even among people who don't really have so much of a spiritual connection. They're just recognizing that you have these fractalization patterns that appear at different levels of the different manifestations and implementations in science. So if you look at the big picture, then you need to have that formal cause, but then there's also the final cause, or the telos of existence, which is even more difficult for people who come from a more scientific objectivist type of perspective to recognize. But I think that this is actually, we have to have that. That is something that we can recognize, especially here, I guess, here and here. That's the perspectival in your subjective, and also in intersubjectively. That's where that comes from, and then you can articulate that. We can talk about it. We can refine it from the here and here. So I think that does need to be there, since that's a really important aspect of lived experience.
Personally, I kind of really applaud what you're attempting to do, because I think it's useful to have something which tries to look at the patterns within all the kind of related fields. A bit like Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy. Much more complicated than what he wrote. But so I applaud that there are a lot of similarities within these different sort of methods. I don't know enough about each of the different kind of models that they're using to be able to make many kind of intelligent kind of comments about how accurate or how well placed you've done sort of this. But I do applaud your effort, and to me it makes sense, and it's the sort of thing that I might use as a kind of reference thing to go to. If I'm going down a particular avenue, then it might stimulate me to think, it could be worth going this way, connections and different ways of kind of looking at things. So I do feel it is a useful project to engage in. I think you'd probably have to show it to the relevant people to, see what they say, whether it makes sense to them or whether they just, blow things out of the water. One thing on my own particular focus, and I'm not quite sure, the thing that, for me, the fundamental problem in the world is, at this point in time, is people's unhealed emotional trauma. And I'm not quite sure how that would fit into all of this system, because to me, it's the unhealed emotional trauma that creates the blockages in our ability to communicate and cooperate and understand one another a lot of the time. It's not the only thing, but for me, it's the primary thing that gets in the way of our being able to work together, and is the primary cause of most of the social problems that we have now.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think I have the word trauma here, but I should include that. I should incorporate that. That's kind of the idea, is the conflict to overcome and the shadow that's somewhere in here. That's the idea.
Yeah, because sometimes my experience is like, because I think sometimes people have the idea that if you know that there's a problem, like if you could see the shadow, then it's, enough to sort of see it. But my experience is that healing the trauma involves far more than understanding it. There's actual being able to go into this stuff is what changes it, but you can't necessarily voluntarily heal. It's not an intellectual thing. It's very much a kind of a felt thing, which sometimes only happens when you're kind of forced into it, when you have a nervous breakdown or, something happens. But yeah, okay. I think it's worth having a place for that within your model.
Absolutely. Yeah. Actually, one thing I'm going to do is, once I get I'm going to have the recording, I'm going to transcribe it. And a lot of the work that I have, actually, and a lot of the materials I put out, they essentially come from me, being forced to explain, okay, what am I talking about here? And then I transcribe that, and then it becomes part of my writing. So in this case, yeah, there'll be, I'll be looking at the transcript. I'll be adding content to it. Okay. Thank you for that. You're definitely welcome to use this. I am going to publish this, and of course, this is just it's a draft. I have some things underway where I'm going to be working with, as you say, the relevant people. There is a project that I got recruited into that is specifically, it's called the ARC, or the Archdisciplinary, not quite, the ARC, so it's ARC for short, but Archdisciplinary, I can't remember what the C stands for, because they were thinking about calling it the Archdisciplinary Society, but I know that the C doesn't, it's not an S, it's a C. And there is essentially what they're doing is initially they're going to be comparing Wilber's work to Henrique's work. And they already put out a request for proposals for research work, and I already said, this is what I want to study. And also there's an integral conference coming up in a few weeks that I'm going to be attending, and I'm going to be bringing this there, see if there's a possibility I might be able to present some of it.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Well done.
There's definitely going to be a process through which this gets refined and professionalized. I am actually just an independent scholar. I only have a degree in computer science, so I've done a lot of I suppose you can say I'm an autodidact. I've done a lot of personal studies, and in my attempts to understand this, was really interested in understanding a lot of this. And this just came together because I that's kind of the way my mind works, is I'm either going to find the deeper patterns, or I'm really just, it's not going to make sense to me at all. So this was, I put a lot of this together in my own attempts to understand what I was trying to, what I was learning, what I was hearing. So that there needs to be, I'm going to have to collaborate with other people to really bring this across the finish line to where it's more professional. That there's people who have been doing this for decades, and I'm pretty sure this is a lot of this is original because I've already shown it to the likes of Bruce Alderman and Layman Pascal, Daniel Gertz, Emil Einer-Fries, and others, and they said it kind of seemed original, although Emil did admit, well, that could be 50% bullshit, but that's not a bad ratio. The version that I showed him at that time only had 4 rows there. I think it was Layman also who told me it needed to be expanded to 6. I only had that initially. And I also had it initially up until just last month. Like there's versions of this that are already published, or at least let the Google Doc. Some of you guys might have seen it because I think hundreds of people have already seen it, where it primarily had these 2 rows for each of the subjective and intersubjective, but that it was differentiated by thinking fast and slow, like the system 1 versus system 2. And so I had to rework it to be more primarily based on the 4 P's of knowing, or at least 3 of the 4. And hopefully you guys can see why I didn't need a distinct row for procedural knowing, because learning any one of these practices, that's procedural knowing. So you would almost, it's almost redundant to say, okay, well, you're going to memorize any one of these practices, and that's procedural knowing in its own right. That isn't a way of really developing anything other than just a rote memorization. So it didn't need to be represented distinctly in this table, even though that is a distinct form of knowing, admittedly.
I've noticed that there tends to be this metaphysical pattern where sometimes 3 becomes 4, but then there's other instances where it gets collapsed again. I'm wondering if you could speak to your perspective on that, because obviously you've made that move.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a different thing. I guess there's more than one situation where a 3 would go into a 4, or vice versa. In this case, what I can see is, okay, so these 3 are in the upper left. These 3 are in the lower left. Although not all of the rows are inner experiences, or because what is truly in the upper left or lower left, subjective or intersubjective, are things that are, what you experience. Then I have correlations to psychology, to biology, and these two rows are in the Wilber's upper right. And I wasn't sure how to present this in the table. I don't actually have anything in the lower right in this table. So that's one way in which I if you were to, say, what are the so-called big 3, the good, the true, the beautiful, you'd say, okay, well, these 3 here, most of the content, aside from those 2 rows, is the beautiful. Down here, most of the content is the good. And these rows, these 2 columns are the true. And essentially, when you take that 3, this is in Wilber's book as well. It's he gets into this quite extensively in his main book that explains the quadrants and how you just take that big 3 and you subdivide the true into a true that aligns more directly with the subjective, and then another kind of truth that aligns more directly with the intersubjective, and that gets you to systems thinking. So I actually do think that I could expand on this to offer correlations into systems thinking, and that's something I'm working on as well. You know, you essentially have an emergence, or what looking at these UTOK mind plane correlates. For those of you who are familiar with Henrique's work, the top plane that he has is culture, and that's a complexity thinking. That would be in the lower right. That involves things such as spiral dynamics and political systems and economic systems. And I do think that there's ways that I can offer additional correlations here. I just haven't done that yet. That is something it's interesting to me, and I've been looking into that as well. I actually put together some initial work into how to understand what would be the key ideas of society and culture and politics and economics. That because Gregg Henriques has key ideas. If you are familiar with his system, he has, the tree of knowledge as one of the key ideas, and also several key ideas for how the mind works, including the justification systems theory and the influence matrix and the behavioral investment theory. But then he doesn't have key ideas for the more complex society, culture, political, economic systems. But it's not difficult to think of what those would be. One of them, I think, would be spiral dynamics. And then there's others that I would think would come from people who wrote books like Francis Fukuyama explaining the rise and fall of political systems. And you have other people who have written books about other aspects of social systems. And then if we had that sort of like, here's the key ideas and how they're related to each other, be quite an effort to do that. But then we could also show that there are these correlations here, and then we would then expand this like sort of 3 into 4. But that's down the line.
Are you familiar with Matthew Perkowski?
Yeah. So I think Perkowski, hold on a second. Let me see if I can remember. Refresh me.
You should, if you're going to do the complexity piece, you should look into his work.
I think I did. So I actually have, it's just not everything is right at the front of my mind right now, but I was working on this exercise with other people of what would be the key ideas of social science. And I got like pages of notes there, and that I'm pretty sure we have Perkowski in that. And if you'd like to talk about that at a future time, that's another thing that I put together. Not that I really know that much about it. I just couldn't help, as I was saying, this is the way my mind works. I'm like, okay, how are these things related to each other?
I have a similar mind. I can relate.
All right. Well, we should link up later and figure, talk more about some of this stuff and bounce ideas off each other.
Cool. That'd be awesome.
I think I saw some version of this a while back and looked at it. It might have been the type 1 and type 2 thinking one that you had. So my background is strong in integral and Buddhism, and a follower of Vervaeke. A little bit with Gregg, although for some reason, it doesn't make as much sense to me as other things. And I don't know why, because I'm a biologist by education. So anyway, so for me, I probably have to go back and look at this a little more carefully and read it and look at it and try to synthesize it. I am a little worried about your not having the lower right, because
Yeah,
you know,
it's a like it's coming.
yeah. Because in, you know, integral, Ken Wilber talks about how all four quadrants tetra-rise in any given moment. So in our moment right now, all of those are arising. And so it's, you know, it is a vital thing. And it's one of my, I don't know if you've ever read that in the integral coaching, the four quadrants, you have a preference or a one that you come from. And so mine is the first, the upper left, but then the second is the lower right. So I do a system-like kind of look at things. So this excites me. I'm excited, but I do have to go back. I'm not one that can take everything in all at once. I would, you know, if you make this available, I will definitely go look at it and study it. Because there are some things that are just like twisting in me. And I'm going, oh, wait a minute, I need to look at what he really means by that, because it's not fitting quite right. So, and it might just be because of lack of understanding, which is probably what it is. My one thing though is I'm going to look at it from a very Buddhist point of view as well, because I think how the Buddhists view the relative and absolute is just so critical that people just don't really get very well. They tend to conflate the two. So anyway, those are some of my comments.
Yeah, you know, and actually, one thing I want to say that I just, there's so much to say when I'm framing this initially, and it was difficult for me to really get to it because I didn't know how well you guys know integral. But here's what it is. These three lines they actually live in the upper left. These ones do too. They're just they're interdevelopmental lines, interpersonal developmental lines that hone your interpersonal capacities. So that is essentially a relation to the lower left. What lives in the lower left more directly are, you know, cultural forms, you know, so you could say there are cultural forms that correlate to each of these that live in the lower left more clearly, you know, but that's not what these really are. Also, I think that you could probably identify each one of these with a level of the spiral dynamics, you know, like when society primarily drives off one of these, you know, what does that look like? What aspect of your inner cognition is becoming dominant? So that you can see that kind of here, where one of these is essentially, you know, this one is blue, or I'm sorry, no, this one's blue. Okay, and one of these is more green, you know. I wasn't really trying to present it that way, but there is a way to interpret this or recognize that connection and correlation that it has to that.
Wouldn't it be more that each of those have their developmental areas? I mean, I'd have to look at this way more closely.
Yeah, probably. I think that yes, each of these developmental lines in their own right goes through these stages. But then you can see this is actually the way spiral dynamics is structured. It is structured based on the tripartite mind, and also whether the individual or the collective is being more dominant. So that's why you have 3 first-tier levels. Now, if we were to do that, we could, 6 first-tier levels. One thing actually I wanted to, you'd probably have to say is that these two are quite different than orange and green, because of the way I'm defining them, they are already a certain kind of integral. So I would, if I wanted to cover the bases, then I would say, you know, what is it like when a society is just propositional of the interpersonal and doesn't pre-integrate, doesn't work to integrate or more embodied foundational forms, well, then you have orange at this level. But I didn't say that. Yeah, I said, well, this is vision logic. So I'm essentially, I'm not including in my table here the inner cognition forms that correlate to orange or to green. Although if I was to cover my bases, I would. It's just you kind of know what that would be. It would, instead of vision logic, this would just be logic. It would just be like, rational logic, that's everything. And then down here, it would be like, essentially, rather than applied complexity, and I'm not sure if that's the best word, by the way, instead of it being, embodied wisdom at this level, this is more turquoise, right? At green, it would just be more like, the deconstruction of perspectives then, right? So that's something that plays into this, and I don't have that level of granularity, even though within our cognition and our embodied experience, we have the ability to bracket out our found the ground of our embodied experience, which is what we do all the time in our society, and you can see the different people who are at those developmental levels of orange and green are doing just that. I don't have that in this table because that's kind of boring, and you already know that people can do that, and it's not, for me, it's not even worth mentioning. But there's a lot of details that I could add here, and this is definitely open to critique, and maybe even the parts that I am including and choosing in some cases not to include. That might, in some cases, add to more confusion than it clears up. So, I'm hoping that the document isn't too complicated to read. I don't know if that made sense. Essentially, what I'm saying is that each of these, you can drive a society on that. You can drive a society based on that. And then we've seen that, or that's how spiral dynamics is intended to be understood. You look at the original Beck and Cowan, I'm sorry, no, the original, what was it? Claire Graves, that's how he defined it. He started with the tripartite model of mind and then said, okay, you could be either self-focused in that society or group focused. So there's 6. And then you could have a second tier, which has an integral form of each of those, of the self-focused integral and also the group-focused integral, which corresponds then to the yellow level and the turquoise level, I think. So if I were to cover all the bases there, I would have actually had this be 8. I just left out the ones that I thought were not practices that I wanted to highlight as things we needed to hone, because people are already doing that in society so much, so why bother? So therefore, you could essentially say, what is the practice? What is the practice that just hones our propositional knowing in absence of everything else? I could have that. And then this row would be different, because you're honing not only propositional knowing, but also perspectival and procedural and participatory, all coming together, of the individual. And then this down here would be, okay, what is that, essentially for a collective. So you can see the pattern. You can, if you are kind of getting the understanding of what I'm saying, there's a pattern that connects this into spiral dynamics. If I wanted to go there, that's a lot of work. I haven't got there yet. But anyways, what I could do is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload this to make the document public. I'm going to share it with everybody, and you guys can add comments or questions in the coming days or weeks if you'd like.
Great. I'll look forward to studying it and embodying it somehow. Feel it in my body. I have to take off. I have 2 dogs and a cat that want dinner right now.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And
thank you.